everyone, and welcome to another episode of Asia Pacific Conversations. My name is Veena Najibullah, and I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Raja Mohan as a guest on the podcast. He is one of India's most exceptional thinkers on foreign policy, geopolitics, and strategic positioning. He's had many positions in journalism, in academia, as well as think tanks. Right now, he's a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. He's also had teaching positions at JNU as well as NTU in Singapore. He's written a number of books on India's foreign policy, on India-US relations, on India-China relations. I believe his forthcoming book is called India and the Asian Rebalance. So we couldn't have a more distinguished and more appropriate guest for a conversation about how India is seeing the current moment, the rebalancing and the shifts that are happening under President Trump's leadership. Someone who could also speak about Canada-India relations in the context of India-US relations and India's relations with the West more generally. So it is an absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Mohan on the podcast, as well as to Canada. I'm happy to say that this conversation is taking place with Professor Mohan in Montreal, where he's visiting as a distinguished fellow for the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. So Raja, a very warm welcome to you to the show. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Veena. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and thank you for coming to Canada. I hope you're enjoying your first few days here in Montreal.
Thank you. Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. Okay, well, let's start then with the current moment. Lots of people are talking about how we're seeing these seismic shifts, that it's basically a moment of unparalleled change and disruption, that President Trump is reordering alliances, global institutions, as well as, of course, U.S. foreign policy. Could you give us a perspective from India? How is India seeing these changes? How is India reacting to what we're seeing in the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think India is probably more confident, more self-assured than many of U.S. allies who are trying to cope with what seemingly a deep structural change in the United States. One reason for that, on the question of alliances, India is not a formal ally of the United States. Therefore, it's never kind of completely depended on the US for its security. Therefore, I think it's more open in terms of engaging with that issue. And the Trump's talk about burden sharing is something that suits India, that India is willing to do more, and provided the US is willing to help India become a stronger power. So I think India is in a better position on the security issues. On trade issues, India has been far more vulnerable to US pressures. And we saw that even in the first term of Trump, where he talked about India being a tariff king. So I think India's moved pretty quickly on the issue, trying to negotiate seriously with the Trump administration. And when Prime Minister Modi went to Washington in February, they'd agreed to negotiate a broad bilateral trade agreement before the fall of this year. And on the rest of the other issues, there is significant continuity with the Biden administration. They focus on technology, a focus on regional security in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. So overall, I would say India is in a reasonably well placed to deal with the Trump disruption, if you will.
Interesting. And I think a lot of people here in Canada certainly have seen that the tone of the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Washington was generally fairly positive. And in some ways, India, Japan, and a few other allies in the Indo-Pacific seem to be weathering the storm and the changes, as you said, more calmly. Is there a way that India is discussing Trump 2.0 versus Trump 1.0? Are you seeing kind of any changes, or what would be different in the way India dealt with Trump 1 versus this current administration?
No, what one sees is that in Trump 1.0, Trump was not fully in command. I mean, he had to accommodate large parts of the US establishment, which kind of restrained him from doing what he wanted to do. So 4 years in the wilderness, facing all those cases that brought against him, and the big majority he's got in these elections, I think has given him the confidence. And I think they're very clear that they're not going to waste any time. They're going to go full steam, pushing their alternative agenda and flooding the zone, if you will, with several initiatives on across the very broad front. So there is actually a far more decisive, a far more aggressive, and far more sweeping changes that Trump administration has initiated on a range of global issues, whether it is reforming the trade system, whether it's reinventing American manufacturing. So I think you got to deal with this far more purposefully than we had in the Trump 1.0. And India realizes that this time you can't string this along, that India will have to make its own moves. And India loves doing things slowly, but I think they realize the urgency of getting the trade deal done and using the international crisis at this point to its advantage.
It's interesting. So you mentioned that India is trying to move quickly on trade, which would be quite unusual for India. As you mentioned, India takes its time and certainly has taken decades sometimes to make agreements with other Western countries. So they're moving on trade largely in anticipation of the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd, or how is that being seen? Like what else is happening in addition to obviously trade and tariffs in the bilateral relationship?
No, there are other issues as well. I mean, for example, India had agreed to buy more energy from the US. India has also agreed to buy more weapons from the United States. And the two sides are also looking at deepening the technological cooperation that was initiated in a big way under the Biden administration, called the ISET Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies. When Mr. Modi went to Washington, this was rebranded, but essentially trying to continue that progress. But I think the difference this time is Trump wants to see action. He wants a result-oriented dialogue, and he wants things to actually happen so that if there's a trade deal, in fact, we're talking about a pretty, shall we call a early harvest. There's some hopes that that can be done in the next few weeks. I don't know whether that'll be fast enough to evade the April 2 unilateral tariffs. But I think they want to have a number of deliverables in place by September, October, when Trump is expected to come to Delhi for the Quad Summit this year. This year is India's turn to host the Quad Summit. So I think it's going to be pretty action-packed on the India-US front, trying to do several deals in time for that visit.
And so if there are, in fact, tariffs on India imposed on April 2nd, how do you think India will respond? Will it just try to continue with the trade negotiations and sort of diplomacy and deal making, or will there be any retaliatory countermeasures?
My sense is that the impact of these tariffs, sector by sector, some analysis have been made that it's not going to be very, very dramatic. But I don't think India's strategy is to retaliate, though for domestic reasons they might have to impose some tariffs. But I think they're hoping, I mean, even I was reading the newspapers in the last 2 days where they think some deal at least can be done and an exemption can be sought. But I'm not so sure whether they can get an exemption. But I think you have to move along. I mean, tariffs will be done. In fact, if you remember in the Trump 1.0, the administration had withdrawn the GSP preferential tariffs on India. They had imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on India. So I think India will have to take that as a given and deal with it, because I think the ambition is to go beyond the immediate product by product tariffs and to look at a deeper trade deal that the two countries can work with over the longer term. And the ambition to raise trade currently at $200 billion a year to $500 billion a year by 2030.
That makes sense. So essentially what I'm hearing is that bilaterally, India feels relatively confident that it can manage the relations with the US under President Trump, and that essentially it needs to kind of keep moving on certain files on technology, on trade. But if we look more broadly then on the impact of President Trump's policies on India's foreign policy writ large, how India sees itself in the region in the Indo-Pacific, but also its relations with Europe, maybe we can start with Europe and Ukraine in particular. There's a lot of talk right now about some kind of a settlement. What's India's positions on that? Will India take part in a peacekeeping arrangement of some sorts? What would be the impact of an end to conflict, Russia normalization with the US, kind of that whole gamut of issues. I know that's a lot in that question, but maybe you could give your reflections on the current state with Ukraine.
I think on the Ukraine, I think there is some sense of satisfaction in Delhi that it had called the crisis right in 22, that while India was widely criticized for not condemning Russian invasion, while, seemingly not willing to abandon its special relationship with Russia. Today, the fact that US itself is turning towards Russia, I think it vindicates India's position that, look, large countries cannot simply, uh, you know, just jump into a position because major powers are doing it. So there is, I think, a sense of indication that India's so-called neutrality was a sensible policy. Second, I think but beyond that, what Delhi sees is that a potential for a historic shift in US-Russia relationship, which is for India, US and Russia that get along will be good, in the sense that any loosening of the Russia-China relationship would be welcomed in Delhi. But I think Delhi sees, of course, nobody's going to be able to predict the full outcome of Trump's diplomacy towards Russia, China, and Europe. But my sense is there is going to be a loosening up of the old alliances between US and Europe, between Russia and China. And this, I think, gives India some sense, one, to engage with the major powers far more seriously. With the US, we've already talked about. With Europe, I think you had President von der Leyen visit India, right in a first visit outside Europe to Delhi. They're talking about reinvigorating the strategic partnership, renewing the trade talks. So I think India sees an opportunity with Europe as well. A Europe that is diversifying and is willing to look outwards will have a willing partner in Delhi. With Russia, of course, India has had a good relationship. And I think that will continue in the foreseeable future. With China too, I think there is some expectation that there've been some nice noises made in Beijing. India is responding positively, while the situation on the ground still remains very difficult on the border dispute. Trade deficit is very high, 100 billion in favor of China. I think there might be some adjustments on the by Chinese side on the Indian side, but at this point it is still very exploratory. But it is something we might see down the road in the next few weeks.
I'll definitely come back to the India-China relations, but maybe staying a little bit longer on Europe and on Ukraine. So if there are, in fact, greater divisions or tensions between US and Europe vis-a-vis Russia and how to handle the end to the Ukraine conflict, would that in any way impact your relationship with Europe and your relationship with the US? Or how will India try to manage the current kind of differences among the Euro-Atlantic partners?
But I don't think India has an illusion that it can control the variables in Ukraine. It was really largely for the Europeans, Americans, and the Russians. And now with the Americans directly dealing with this problem, whatever comes out of it is something that others have to respond to. So it's not that there was a time when you could say Europeans have a role in influencing American approach, but now they don't have that role. So we're still not clear how exactly this will pan out. But my sense is that for India, peace in Ukraine, whatever form it takes, is good. Because I think last 3 years, the impact of the Ukraine war on energy prices, on food inflation, has all been quite tremendous. So any loosening of the tensions there, decrease in the energy prices, all that would be very, very welcome for India, which is a big importer of energy. In terms of what, if you remember, late last year, Prime Minister Modi went to Ukraine. He went to Poland to tell the Ukrainians and its supporters in Europe that, look, India is not on the side of Russia. It is actually wants peace. It wants to help bring peace. So I think that message had some effect, I think. But at this point, if there is actually a deal and they're looking for peacekeeping, when there are big ifs here, that whether India will be invited is something to be seen. But I think India will be quite happy to help along in any process. But I don't think Delhi has any illusions. Somehow it is the principal actor shaping the outcomes. And once the US is directly talking to Russia, so I think India will be happy to help along on the margins to the outcomes.
And with respect to discussions that are now happening in many capitals, but certainly in Europe, on the nuclear umbrella of the U.S. and the kind of the sort of challenges to the NPT and the whole regime around nonproliferation, what's the view in Delhi? How is New Delhi watching and seeing these debates, both in Asia and South Korea, in Japan, as well as in Germany and elsewhere in Europe?
Look, I think we are still not at a point where the NPT has to be violated for expanded European nuclear deterrent. At this point, what Germany and others are talking about is to find a way to strengthen the Euro deterrent, which is really the British part and the French part, whether that can be extended to cover the rest of the Europe. Until now, Europe has depended on America's extended deterrence, and the French nuclear deterrent largely has been a national one. It's not been a collective one. And France is talking about, extending the deterrence, and I think Poland and other frontline states want to see stronger. So this all can be managed without disrupting the NPT. So I think we are a long way from actually breaking the NPT in Europe. And in any case, American weapons have already been deployed in some European countries. My sense is, as France builds up its nuclear arsenal, we could see some of the similar framework emerge, but we are some distance away. But I don't think the treaty is under threat in Europe. In Asia, I think it's a little more serious, with South Korea increasingly feeling vulnerable. But this was less to do with Ukraine. I think North Korea has had nuclear weapons for a long time. And until now, the assumption was North Korea is not nuclear, it will be denuclearized. And if that is not going to be the case, then I think South Korea will have to rethink its position. And my sense is that at least sections in Washington who see having South Korea acquire nuclear weapons and even Japan would not be a bad thing. So I think when these two countries cross the line, maybe the nuclear system will have a challenge. But my sense is the idea that NPT will break if South Korea or Japan become nuclear. If it didn't break because North Korea became nuclear, I don't see why it should break if South Korea becomes nuclear. I don't think countries go nuclear because somebody else has gone nuclear. I think countries go nuclear if they face a threat that can't be managed in any other way. So in some sense, you could even argue having Japan and South Korea as nuclear weapons powers would bring a reasonable local balance of power between China and its neighbors. That might not be such a bad thing. So I think it frame it as some kind of a collapse of the NPT would be incorrect in my view, because Pakistan did not go nuclear because the NPT system was unfair, because it thought India has nuclear weapons. So my sense is it's more based on the threat situation, and in Asia, if there is a local balances of nuclear deterrent, that might not be a terrible thing.
Right, and I guess there's also fears about U.S. extended deterrence and whether or not U.S. will be there, particularly for Korea, because you're right, the threats from North Korea have pre-existed, but U.S. was seen as much more reliable ally. You had mentioned China and, of course, India's relations with China. There's a lot of anxiety in some places in Asia. I was just in Taiwan and in Singapore about a possible US-China sort of grand bargain of some sort, or seeing President Trump kind of make the same type of overtures to President Xi that he's been making to Putin, and what that would mean for US allies in Asia. Now, I understand, of course, India is not a formal ally. So again, you're in a better position than Korea or Philippines or Japan or Taiwan. But to what extent India's current discussions with China on the border, or more generally on relations, impacted by what's happening in Washington, or to what extent that's a natural sort of progression in the bilateral relations between India and China? And where do you see that relationship going?
Yeah, I think the China-US relationship, how that will unfold, I think is a big variable. I think here we're seeing two, three contradictory trends. I mean, I think one, we've seen much of the MAGA movement is very anti-China. Many of the people that Trump has appointed to the national security positions are very hard on China. And what we saw in the meetings between Trump and Mr. Modi, Trump and Mr. Ishiba, Trump and the Mr. Marles of the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, they've all shown a continuity with the previous policy of stronger Quad, stronger
Yes.
Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, you have a section of Trump's backers who think US should not overextend itself. US should not, get into defending Taiwan or take too much of responsibility in Asia. And Trump himself talks about the need to get along with China and need to do a deal. So we're not sure how this will play out. I mean, I think my sense is that just as if Trump has made out with Russia, he might also try to reach out and cut an understanding with Xi Jinping. So this is part of his overall philosophy that look, US should get along with the other major powers. In some senses, this is also very Kissingerian, where Henry Kissinger used to say US should have better relationship with Russia and China, that those relationships be better than what Russia and China have with each other. What's happened in the last decade is now Russia and China are very close to each other. So therefore, a US that can move both of them, ease those relationships with both, would improve its position in the great power dynamic. Whether they can actually get there or not, we don't know. But my sense is both Russia and China will be eager to do deals, bilateral deals with the United States. In the Russia case, it's at this point is focused straightforward on Ukraine and European security order. But in the case of China, it's much more complex because China and the US have a huge economic relationship and a whole range of other issues that complicate it. But I think much of Asia is already getting used to the fact, take advantage of the continuity to the extent that there is, but also mentally prepare for potential big changes in US policy. We're seeing some, meanwhile, smile diplomacy from Chinese side. A few days ago, there was a meeting between the Koreans, the South Koreans, the Japanese, and the Chinese, talking about regional economic cooperation. And the, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said something about elephant and the dragon, that is India and China working together. So I think, given the uncertainty in the alliances and US economic demands, China seems to be exploring for some space and to improve its relations with the neighbors. If you look at the last 10 years, the needle was moving the other way. China was tough with its neighbors, and America had built up a coalition with Quad, with AUKUS, and bringing the Koreans and the Japanese together. But now things could go the other way if Trump does not make a special effort to keep the alliances and the relationships going.
So if there is, I mean, of course, it's the big if, but if there is some kind of a division into various spheres of influence and Russia and China and US get their own spheres, where does that leave India? What would be India's sphere? Is it in its own sub-region? But of course, China has made lots of inroads. Like, how does India view this conversation about spheres of influence?
I think spheres of influence sounds very good in theory, but it's very hard to implement that kind of a thing. And I think, yes, in the in the 19th century, there were those kind of arrangements. Then after the Second World War, the US agreed to Russia's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. But today, I don't think, even if Trump says, look, okay, you have a sphere of influence in Europe, you think the Poles would want to live under the Russian domination? Would you want the Balts to live under the Russian domination? They won't. So I think the idea that you can simply carve up this into spheres of influence is not. It doesn't work because at this point, at least, if Russians want to have a sphere of influence, they need to depend more on seduction rather than coercion. But unfortunately, the Russians have rolled the dice on coercion, and it'll be a long while before the Europeans will trust them. So therefore, there is a problem there. Similarly, on China, how much China talks about Asia for Asians and how Americans should get out of Asia, they would have this happy Asian brotherhood flourishing. But I think all of China's neighbors know if America leaves, if Asia for Asians is really about Chinese hegemony. Therefore, even the smallest countries are not going to simply accept Chinese dominance. But China has been better than Russia in terms of cultivating deep economic relationships, make sure that its influence is not dependent on force. But yet, Japan or India or for example, Vietnam are not going to simply say, look, we welcome a Chinese sphere of influence. India too would love to have a sphere of influence in South Asia, but none of our neighbors would want to have that. So I think what you need is, I think, some kind of a broad understanding, probable, between US, Russia, and China, and other powers to say, look, at least agree on some rules. More like a concert of Europe kind of a thing, which came after the Napoleonic Wars, rather than the clear spheres of influence, which in modern day are not easy to implement.
That makes sense. You mentioned about China being more effective and sort of having economic relationships, particularly in Southeast Asia and in South Asia and elsewhere. And many would argue that certainly countries like Vietnam and Malaysia have really taken advantage both of China, but also of de-risking policies that the US and others have put in place. Observers have also watched India's economic growth and recent economic slowdown and have made comments in terms of what would be really India's trajectory if its relationship with China don't improve, if India is not benefiting from China plus one strategies, if India is not benefiting from Chinese capital. How do you see sort of India's current plans vis-a-vis technology, vis-a-vis economic growth, and kind of managing the current unpredictability from the US, but also not having China as an option?
I don't think India has a China option at all. I mean, I think the option we talk about is relaxation of some tensions. While China trade is problematic, and there's no seeming way in which that can be reversed, because China is now at 35% of the global manufacturing. They're dumping goods everywhere. So this notion that we can have some kind of an economic accommodation with China, that seems very, very difficult to do at this point. So India's economic future then is really tied to the West, to the US, to Europe, to the Anglo-Saxon world, which is what India has doubled down to accelerate the trade talks with the US, to renew them with UK, with Europe, with New Zealand. So I think India is really seeing the long-term economic trajectory is in collaboration with the Western world, and because there is more complementarity there, and that India, China, US, and Europe don't do things that India produces. So there is actually room for a real free trade arrangement there. On the security issue too, I mean, I think finding some measure of balance in China remains the principal policy. There again, working with the US and the Europeans remains the main objective. But what India wants with China is to, we can't, wish away the other. And the fact is, if we can produce even a relatively stable, peaceful coexistence, is the best India can hope for. So that you reduce the military dangers on the border and work out an arrangement where you can live as neighbors rather than as friends or buddies, which has been the historic illusion. So I think India will be looking for that. But that doesn't mean India is going to be taking Chinese side or abandon its effort on the West in order to please the Chinese.
You mentioned that India's economic future is with the West in cooperation with the US, with the EU, with the Anglo-Saxon world. And we've certainly seen a lot of progress in US-India relations, as well as EU, Australia, and others. The one notable exception is, of course, Canada, where we're recording this from today. So this is a nice segue for us to speak a little bit about Canada-India relations. And maybe as a kind of starting place, if you could reflect a little bit on why Canada's relationship with India, from your perspective or from India's perspective, has been more difficult than with Australia or UK or US, where some of the issues that I see as challenging also exist. But with Canada, it seems like things keep going from bad to worse. If you could reflect on that.
Look, I think things have not been good last decade. But my sense is the new election that has been called in Canada, I think provides an opportunity, an opening to take a fresh look at the bilateral relationship and to say, look, go back to basics. See, look, we have problems that emerged in the last decade. How do we address them? Can we create a process to deal with those issues? But at the same time, seeking to expand engagement on a range of issues. I think from trade, from technology to Indo-Pacific, I think these are possible because I think one of the good things in democracies is governments do change, and when they change, they don't have to own everything the previous government did, and therefore that creates a fresh basis for looking at the relationship. My own view is that Delhi is ready for a reset in this relationship. Because throughout the crisis that we've had in the last few years, Delhi never lost sight of the fact that, look, Canada is an important global player. It's in the G7. It's got more than, its economy is almost bigger than Russia's, with a 2 trillion plus economy. It's a major producer of natural resources, which India needs for its own industrial growth. So I don't think Delhi has ever lost sight of that importance of Canada. But the issue that came out in terms of how the question of what India sees as a threat to its territorial integrity, with actions that were going on, and what Canada sees as transnational repression, those issues, I think Delhi will be open, I think, to addressing them. I think if only the two establishments sit down and engage with each other, and then look at the rest of the relationship as well. My own sense is there is room to start with some confidence building measures, restoring high commissioners, for example, improving the visa facilities so that people can actually begin to go to each other's places, and while addressing the disputes that exist. So my sense is, given the changing global context, I think both countries, both are large economies. I mean, India is the fifth largest economy in the world. I think for both of us, it's a good moment to put the crisis of the issues of the last few years in its perspective, and say, look, how do we maximize our possibilities in the international system, given the big inflection point at which the world is going through.
I think it's really helpful to hear that. And you're absolutely right that a political transition does offer a moment of opportunity. Certainly, it's a reset in tone and rhetoric, if not in substance. And it's reassuring for me to hear that you think Delhi might be ready to deal with the actual bilateral dispute, because at the moment we do have a case that Canada has brought forward about the murdering of the Khalistani activist in British Columbia. There needs to be some process for justice and accountability. That's something that obviously would be necessary to open up political space for that reset. And it's good to hear that you're saying there might be some openness on the India side on that. You mentioned confidence building measures like the exchange of high commissioners. Are there other things that you feel like could essentially help to put some elements of the relationship back on track while we are dealing with this other bigger dispute?
Yeah, absolutely. For example, trade talks. I mean, I think one of the unfortunate things that happened in the last year of the crisis was suspending the trade talks. So I think resuming the trade talks, because through the last year, I mean, I think the Canadian investor interest in India has not declined, and India's interest in Canadian resources has not declined. So my sense is resuming the trade talks. And for Canada is seeking to diversify its trade relationships away from the US. India is again trying to revive the trade talks with, as I mentioned, with all the major economies, including the US and the Anglo-Saxon economies. So I think the trade issue could be a good way of looking at the broader bilateral relationship.
Are there elements of trade? Because we often speak of trade as sort of exchange of goods and services, but of course there's also a lot of cooperation that can happen in the technology sector, that can happen around issues of supply chains, around economic security. So more of an economic partnership rather than a traditional FTA. What are your thoughts on that in terms of what might be sectors, space, AI, other things that could be part of a broader economic partnership conversation rather than a traditional FTA?
No, in fact, it is called the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, CEPA, right? So in a way, given the economic security issue, that's what I think trade is the center around which those issues can be dealt with. But I think technology is a separate. I think if you see technology is right on the top of the agenda for India with the US, with UK, with Europe, with Australia. So my sense is we could put that right at the top because Canada has strong equities in the technology sector. So does India. I think this is a conversation. I think it's a good time to have that as well, as we see the technological landscape in the world changing fundamentally. with what's happening in the US, with this unfolding revolution in artificial intelligence, both in terms of technology itself, as well as in the governing structures that the world is negotiating. So there is a lot of room there for India and Canada to engage each other.
One area where Canada has engaged in through our Indo-Pacific strategy with Southeast Asia and with other partners in the region is around maritime security and maritime domain awareness, because of course Canada has 3 oceans and we're very interested in partnerships in that area. Do you see much in that domain where Canada and India could cooperate? I know India is trying to be more active in the Indian Ocean. What do you see sort of areas for security and defense cooperation between Canada and
No, I
India?
think maritime issue is highly important for India. So I think Canada is a major maritime power. So my sense is Canada was very instrumental in setting up the Asia Pacific APEC structures 30 years ago. Today, I think it wants to take interest in the Indo-Pacific. We have seen some interest in guidelines, but not a strategy. Hopefully, the next government would come up with a much more, in Ottawa, will come up with a clear strategy on that. So I think the Indo-Pacific is open for engagement. I see Canada is engaging Europe on trade issues, but I think it also has a huge connect to the Pacific side. This is something I think my sense is India and Canada can talk about. Equally, Canada is also a major Arctic nation. India's interest in Arctic is growing. So one way or another, the Arctic issues have come to the fore, whether it's through Greenland or Trump's wanting to annex Canada. So I think Arctic is another issue where India and Canada can work together. And more importantly, I think the larger question of managing the maritime commons, where I think India and Canada have a stake in working together.
One thing, and maybe it's an unfair thing to say, but there are folks in Canada who, because of the recent disputes with China and then right after with India, have come to equate India and China, or sort of see India and China as both kind of having done something that violates Canada's sovereignty and or something that's, at least in behavior, is adversarial. How would you react to that, or what would you say to that when people challenge India's kind of democracy or talk about the shift towards authoritarianism or the strong man under Prime Minister Modi? Like, what would be your message to Canadians who may not be as familiar with India but have this negative perception because of the recent crisis?
See, my own understanding is all this talk about democracy, about other sides' internal arrangements. I think that luxury does not exist for us, for neither of us. That today, I think what's happened in the last few weeks, that the idea that you can judge other countries, that you have the margin to avoid relationship with major economies on the basis of their internal arrangements, I think it was never true. A lot of times, this rhetoric plays well, but I think that peak of that phase is gone across the West. Today, I mean, the fact is, West has done business with China for 40 years. I don't see why they can't do business with India for whatever their complaints about the Modi government are. So I don't buy that as a principal problem. There's always constituencies in the Western countries that talk about these issues, but money has always led the initiatives in terms of, so I don't see political values as a core issue that will derail. Second, I think, look, all countries go through periods of stress, and all relationships go through that, but none of this is permanent. I mean, I've seen China and US, they did not recognize each other for 20 years. Then they were best buddies for the last 40 years. Now they're fighting. So this notion that somehow I got this problem, therefore everything else must come to stop. It never works. The world doesn't work like that. At some point or the other, countries have to find workarounds through difficult problems and engage each other. I think the record of any period you take in the international politics, countries have to find a way out. I've seen India's relations with the US, where US had so many sanctions on India on the nuclear issue. Today, the US is pushing for India to buy more nuclear technology from the US. We've had problems with the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and their relationship with Pakistan. But today, Saudi and the UAE are the best friends of India. So I think life goes on. I mean, for anyone to say, here is an absolute proposition, and I'm not going to do anything with the other country till these propositions are sorted. It's a temporary kind of, you can get on your own high horse, but everybody has to come down the high horse to deal with the reality.
So if Canada was prepared to have functional, good relations with India, what are some key things that we need to understand about India's foreign policy or how India likes to engage with others, how India negotiates? So if you were offering advice in this moment of opportunities you mentioned, or moment of opportunity that might open up in a few weeks in Canada, what are some things for Canadian policymakers to keep in mind about India and how it engages with the world?
Look, I mean, I think we have a deep structural problem that, look, we don't know enough about each other. We've never invested in each other's knowledge about each other's countries. I mean, Canada rightly was part of NATO, it was looking at Europe. And then China through APEC, China was a major partner. But I think for the longer term, and I think we need to really invest in understanding each other a lot more, though we speak the same language. We're part of the Commonwealth. We're part of a number of today several plurilateral institutions like Mineral Security Partnership. We are part of the Artemis Accords. We are part of the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. So I think there are more contact points today. But my sense is still there's not enough appreciation of where we come from. In India, I can tell you, we have very little understanding of Canadian history, Canadian politics. Similarly, the Canadians don't understand what drives India. So I think one is the scholarship and investment. Other is actually having more conversations. I think this crisis should help us begin that conversations between the political leaders, between political parties, between civil societies. I think that's the kind of engagement we need. Business side, yes, there is actually business has improved. There are Canadian investments in India. What is needed is really the broader conversation on the strategic issues to happen, because India too, I think, had high hopes of this relationship under the when Mr. Steve Harper was the Prime Minister of Canada. Things really moved a bit, after the terrible dip after the 1998 nuclear tests. So things can improve. My sense is I've seen India's relations with a large number of countries improve in the last 30 years. Countries we thought was never possible. So I think today Canada is one of the few exceptions to India's generally a good relationship. And my sense is there is deep commitment in Delhi to restore this to its rightful place in India's engagement with the world.
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree with you, Professor Mohans, that probably the most important thing is for us to have better understanding of each other. And that's in part why we appreciate so much the fact that you are taking part in this visiting fellowship, that you are in Canada and meeting with all the important stakeholders, that you've also engaged with us in dialogue when Asia Pacific Foundation brought a delegation of civil society leaders to India in February. It is very much appreciated. And maybe as a final question, Professor, what would be 3 books that you would recommend to Canadians who are interested in better understanding India's position in the world and its foreign policy?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think Indians are just producing a lot of yeah. No, I think recently there was a book by Professor Sriram Chaulia called Friends. It's kind of explores 10 most important relationships that India has with the international system. I think that's an interesting one that is worth looking at. I would also say there is this book by Dhruva Jaishankar on Vishwa Sastra, which is really a book that really gives the basics of India's foreign policy, its evolution over the many years. But I would say really looking for the if you get first-hand understanding. Mr. Jaishankar himself has written, the foreign minister, written 2 books. One is called The India Way, another called the Why Bharat Matters. So I think both these books, I think you get a straight first-hand account of how a foreign minister is now. He's in his 6th year as foreign minister. Before that, he was 3 years as the foreign secretary, and before that, almost 30 odd years in the foreign service. So I think that gives you a good sense of where India is coming from. But I would say again, I mean, beyond these books, to step up this engagement, I mean, because India talks to itself. I mean, we are much like the US or any other democracy. There's a lot of talk, a lot of chatter. So my sense is having the Canadian universities, think tanks to visit India more often, to start talking to people, I think that would help a lot. I think to get a better sense of each other.
Fantastic. Well, that's a really good place to end this conversation. Thank you so much again,
Thank you.
Dr. Mohan, for joining the discussion and for being here with us in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Veena.